Farm managers need to make a number of choices in terms of allocating or where to allocate scarce resources, including capital, time, and their management expertise. And what we're trying to do here is shed some light on the decision making that goes around an investment in zone delineation and being able to better apply nitrogen fertilizer in the different zones. And so the first perspective to apply here is to look at this whole approach to zone delineation as an investment. It's an investment to implement site-specific applications of nitrogen fertilizer, and that would lead you to the question is, how might the farm business be better off adopting and implementing site-specific applications of nitrogen fertilizer? And from there, we undertake what we call framing. How do you look at that question? How do you frame that particular question about how the farm might be better? And the idea of framing is it establishes a perspective that states what information you would gather and how you would analyze that particular information. And so framing the problem is setting the parameters, determining the criteria that would make one option preferable to another. And so ideally, by framing this question, we get to the point where we can make better decisions in terms of on the level of nitrogen to be applied in different areas of the field. One perspective could be this whole idea of a target yield perspective. So the decision focuses on the level of nitrogen to achieve target yields that vary in different areas of the field. And the knowledge that goes with that, part of the investment of management time and energy is getting a strong understanding of all the factors that contribute to a unique target yield in a unique area of the field. Target yield management, you undertake to build a knowledge base of all factors that would determine the target yield, as well as the level of applied nitrogen required to support that target yield. A critical thing, or I guess the interesting thing about a target yield perspective, identifying a target yield and feeding nitrogen to achieve that target yield, is that the cost of fertilizer or the value of the crop is not a consideration. It's strictly a physical feeding the crop type of approach. But it is a valid perspective, and it's a perspective that's used by a number. It's how a number of producers and managers would frame the decision or the investment decision into site-specific application. An alternative or another perspective that can be applied to this whole question of investing in zone delineation and site-specific application of nitrogen fertilizer is where you frame it in terms of trying to achieve economic returns. And so economic return thinking frames the decisions in terms of the added returns, the added economic returns that are gained from additional costs, and basically the additional costs of adding nitrogen fertilizer. And so it enables, by adopting an economic returns perspective, decision making, you enable decision making to determine where in a field additional units of nitrogen will give the greatest economic return. And so one way to think about that is, if you had an extra $10 to spend on nitrogen fertilizer, the economic approach or the economic thinking would allow you to make choices as to where you're going to get the best or the greatest return for spending that extra $10 when you have an option of applying it in different areas of the field. If you go down this path of pursuing economic returns, you'll run into this concept of a response curve. And essentially a response curve identifies or focuses on the yield increases in response to nitrogen fertilizer increases. And those response functions will have unique shapes. And in this whole context of zone delineation, different zones will have different response functions. So where different zones have different yield responses to nitrogen fertilizer increases, there will be different economic returns generated from spending an additional $10 on fertilizer. So the point here is that this economic returns perspective recognizes that spending an additional $10 will generate different returns in different areas of a field. There is a product available from Alberta Agriculture called the Affirm tool. It's a tool that producers could use if they want to go down this path of pursuing economic returns. And I'm just going to have to read it so I get the information correctly here. So Affirm stands for the Alberta Farm Fertilizer Information Recommendation Manager. And it's a program that provides Alberta producers with nitrogen fertilizer response curves for the different agroecological areas in the province. Producers, by inputting soil test results, they are able to determine an economic rate of nitrogen for different crop values, fertilizer costs, and economic circumstances. So it's a tool that allows producers to input their own particular information, but generate, based on their economic circumstances, if they spend another dollar and they have an expectation of a return, say $2, it will determine that economic level of nitrogen application. The response functions allows producers to estimate the incremental revenues generated by adding incremental nitrogen fertilizer. This allows producers to continue adding nitrogen fertilizer as long as it is adding to profits. As well, response functions allow producers to consider risk factors, moisture levels, pests, crop price variability. By continuing to add nitrogen fertilizer as long as each dollar spent on nitrogen generates $1.5 for every dollar spent or $2 for every dollar spent, that kind of risk thinking. Farming Smarter has undertaken field research to provide insight to some of the economic questions related to the site-specific applications of nitrogen fertilizer. These questions include: what are the investment costs of the different approaches to zone delineation? The different approaches to zone delineation that were investigated were surface geography, grid soil sampling, historical yield, electrical conductivity, and combinations of those different approaches. This allowed to look at the capital investment or the upfront investment cost of zone delineation. It allowed to look at the data collected, allowed to look at the net economic benefits of the different approaches. It allowed us to compare the net benefits for each approach and rank those different approaches in terms of the net economic benefits they generated. We also were able to look at the internal rate of return, where the upfront cost of investing in a zone delineation approach basically incurs today, the benefits, and what you're buying is a stream of future benefits. And we were able to look at the internal rate of return so producers can compare that with other investment opportunities. We are also able to use the data to develop response functions, which and there's a handy tool that could be used by decision makers to develop their own response functions so that they can answer the question of, if I have an extra $10 to spend on fertilizer in a particular field, where am I going to get the best return on that additional $10 on nitrogen fertilizer? That allowed us to compare the different methodologies in terms of the net return that they generated. And so under the field research, we were able to generate a wide range of yield responses, and that allowed us to calculate total revenues, subtract both the cost of the nitrogen applied as well as the delineation cost to come up with a net economic return for a wide range of different approaches to zone delineation in 10 different fields. And one of the things that when we look at the comparing the costs, I'm going back to these initial costs here. When we compare the initial costs of zone delineations and we have them ranked, we'll see that the soil sampling cost is the one that's actually quite high. And I guess just to explain what's going on in that ranking of those costs, the soil sampling undertook 32 samples in a 160-acre field, whereas some of the other approaches that used alternative approaches, such as the electrical conductivity approach, the soil sampling, which was the highest cost, was much less. So rather than 32 samples, the EC had 3 soil samples. So the cost of soil sampling was a significant factor in these zone delineation costs. the data allowed us to calculate the net return for each zone under the different approaches to zone delineation, and we were able to determine, based on a weighted average, or a number weighted by the acres in the particular field, we're able to determine a representative economic performance for each report, or pardon me, for each approach. And we had these net economic benefits, both in total as well as for the application of nitrogen fertilizer. So the net benefits to the application of nitrogen fertilizer did not include the investment cost of the zone delineation. The net economic benefits included both the nitrogen fertilizer cost as well as the zone delineation cost. So total revenues would be less the delineation costs, less the nitrogen costs, would be the net economic benefits. All 10 field methodologies were ranked according to net economic benefits. We developed a scoring system. So the approach with the highest net economic benefit got a score of 6, and then it proceeded down from there. So the approach with the lowest net economic benefit, and as well as the lowest return to nitrogen, received the lowest score. So when we looked at all of the methodologies together, surface geography, when we're looking at the rankings, the score system rankings of the net economic benefits, surface geography scored the highest, followed by yield history, followed by electrical conductivity. And in this case, remember, the zone delineation costs are included in there, and it's you could make the argument that grid soil sampling is disadvantaged somewhat because of that high cost. Remember, there was 32 soil samples taken on 160 acres, and that adds significantly to that investment cost. When we looked at ranking the net returns, the net benefits to the nitrogen fertilizer application, the grid soil sampling achieved the highest score, which makes sense because you don't have that higher zone delineation cost in there. So grid soil sampling ranked first, followed by yield history, followed by electrical conductivity. Surface geography came in fourth in that particular ranking approach. We also developed investment return analysis. We calculated the internal rate of return. So we looked at zone delineation as an upfront investment. So remember, there would be the cost of delineating the zones, which included gathering the data and analyzing the data. And then we looked at the stream of benefits that investment would gain. And so that allowed us to calculate an internal rate of return, and which is another way of comparing these things. It should be noted that where you undertake zone delineation, that's an incremental cost over your existing system. The benefits that we measured, we didn't have a baseline of what the baseline economic returns would be, so we really weren't able to look at the incremental economic benefits. What we were able to do, once again, is just rank the different approaches to zone delineation against each other in terms of their internal rate of return. And once again, we developed a scoring system, and in this particular case, the aerial approach to zone delineation achieved the highest score. As mentioned before, the grid soil sampling approach is somewhat handicapped because of the higher upfront costs. So in an analysis like internal rate of return, that higher initial capital cost really brings down the internal rate of return. We also, with the data that was available, we are also able to develop response functions. And so essentially we were able to look at the incremental yield gained from incremental applications of nitrogen fertilizer. Using a mathematical approach that was available from a publication, we were able to calculate a polynomial response function for each situation, for each field, for each zone in each field, as well as the different approaches to zone delineation in each of those circumstances. That mathematical model also allowed us to look at the margin gained from incremental amounts of nitrogen fertilizer. So the field research provided provides some information, some insight, and some knowledge that can be connected with the management decisions that have to be made on the farm. The fundamental question from the management perspective is whether the farm business is better off adopting and implementing site-specific applications of fertilizer. Once again, there's the approach that farmers might use is whether an investment in zone delineation allows them to make better decisions in the context of what level of nitrogen fertilizer to apply in different areas of their field. As mentioned, a target yield perspective that corresponds to differing estimates of level of nitrogen fertilizer that would be applied in different areas of the field. It enables the decision maker to answer the question of what level of nitrogen is required to achieve target yields in different areas of the field. This perspective that I'm talking about, this is the perspective that should be used as a guide in evaluating the investment in zone delineation, and it should also be used as a guide in questioning in terms of the process and the work that's required to gain the information to be able to make those decisions. The target yield perspective, the process that's involved there it's an ongoing process of gathering and refining and understanding the factors that determine different target yields in different areas of the field. The economic perspective focuses on delineating zones in terms of differing yield response functions. This would enable decision makers to answer the question is where in a field additional units of nitrogen will give the greatest economic return. In both these cases, it's an ongoing process of gathering information and enabling better decision making as far as the application of nitrogen fertilizer. Probably the best thing from an economic perspective in terms of this field research is that it does lead to additional questions. Rather than answers, I think we're always better off with good questions. And maybe the questions that producers should consider to guide them in considering site-specific application is, first of all, why are they experiencing yield variation in different areas of their field? That would guide them to gain an understanding of what is really going on. And once you've answered that question of why, I would suggest that the next question would be is how can you best manage that yield variation in terms of applying nitrogen fertilizer? So as I said, I think the field research and the economic thinking that I've tried to apply to it has shone some light on some of the critical issues. We have a better understanding of the investment costs. We're able to rank the different methodologies with each other in terms of not only their capital cost, but the type of returns that they might be able to generate. But as I've suggested, I think the most valuable thing is bringing us to those two questions. Why is there yield variation in different areas of your field? And how might you best manage that yield variation in terms of making the farm business better off?